Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Manifesto. We are in the midst of an all-consuming crisis across the globe uh, with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as elders have always said, you never let a serious crisis go to waste. This huge crisis offers us almost a once in a century opportunity uh, to change our path towards more equity, health, and well being. Transforming cities will be key to this new agenda. In Urban Manifesto, we are laying out a detailed roadmap for not just recovery, but to move away from the mistakes of the past. So we're also so thrilled to host this series as part of Architecture Foundation's 100-day studio. I am Prathima Manohar, founder of the urbanism think do tank in India, the Urban Vision, and I co-host this series with Lucy Bullivant. Lucy?
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm delighted that we're here again to entertain and inform you. I'm also very happy to say that today's theme is co-housing shared living. And really pleased that we have two splendid expert guests with us today. We have Verena Von Beckerath, who is an architect and co-founder of Heide von Beckerath in Berlin, and Francis Wright, who is the head of community partnering at Town, the UK-based developer. So, co-housing, shared living. If you think about it, anything that is self-governed, community-led, housing-based really has a fascinating history. You don't need to go far to find all the really amazing books on the topic. And also there are an awful lot of books that still need to be written. In the here and now, our Urban Manifesto is one where really a top priority for us is to help to avoid the perpetuation of badly, poorly designed, poorly delivered housing, which does absolutely nothing for our physical and mental health whatsoever. And also, schemes where people have very little or no say in the management of them. Now, in response to the crisis of the genuine lack of genuinely affordable housing, community-led solutions, it's absolutely no surprise that they have such a strong appeal as an alternative and a better way to live. You know your neighbors very well, you see them very regularly, you've got mutual support, they'd be friends with your neighbors. There's a lot of interaction, and also everyone gets their needs met by long discussion or short discussion. It is really a strong solution. Now, there was some research done that was announced about just over last year in the UK, which stated that the numbers of community-led housing units or homes in development at that time were just around 17,000. Now that was in stark contrast to the picture 2 years prior to that, which actually showed that there were literally just a third of that in the UK. Now, heaven knows what has happened to the delivery momentum under the pandemic. Very unfortunately, it has almost certainly slowed things up. But however community-led housing is delivered, and what form it takes, whether it's co-housing, community land trusts, cooperatives, every type of community-led housing shares common motivations. People make it together. They make supportive, secure, and genuinely affordable housing solutions that everyone is happy with. So that sounds brilliant, right? So that begs the question, how do we scale it up? How do we overcome the reality that community-led housing is actually at the moment is a niche? how do we pervade the mainstream housing housing development scene? Well, we're going to step back for this session at the outset. We're going to really, for the main thrust of the session, what we're going to do is look at the identities, the priorities, and the processes of co-housing, which is the term we've used in the title. And Verena and Francis are each going to present their manifesto points in relation to the title, with co-housing and shared living. But before we do that, we really have to ask you both, how have you fared under lockdown? Verena.
How I feel about the lockdown?
How have you fared? How do you feel? How have you managed under lockdown?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We are now getting out of the lockdown slowly, maybe a little bit earlier than in the UK and earlier than in the US, and very differently than in other parts of the world. But I think it was quite interesting. It was very challenging for the office, as there were some problems that occurred that we were not waiting for, that we could manage. And at the same time, I had to prepare a digital semester. And my idea was to offer a kind of virtual studio where all the positive effects of the studio, working in the studio, like collective, collaborative working, personal kind of consultation, we could shift to a digital space. So that was quite challenging, and we are quite happy with the way we are doing it at the moment. We are waiting for the results, of course. So I think it's challenging on one hand. It has been difficult, but it has also energized us to experiment with new formats and so on.
Yes. Yes, great. It's double-edged, isn't it? It's got great disadvantages, but if you can look to find the advantages, they're always going to be there. How about you, Francis?
I think it's very similar, that double-edged element to this. But when we're in town, we're all working from home, and it's been lovely not to be getting up early in the morning and traveling to the station. And actually, I think we've all got very used to the sort of virtual communications and meetings, and it just feels a very intense way to work, actually. So it doesn't have the same sort of breathing spaces that going in and meeting people does. And then I also live in Marmalade Lane, town's most recent development, which is a co-housing community. And for that, that's been equally both wonderful to be in during COVID and really supportive, but also really challenging. And I think that's something we'll probably tease out as we go through the show.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So let's move now to Verena's manifesto points. Verena, over to you.
Yeah, will you share my slides?
Yes, Prathima will do that. She's the mastermind.
Okay. Can you share them full screen, maybe?
Yes.
Okay. So I decided to, instead of presenting a manifesto, I'm not the manifesto person, but instead of presenting a manifesto, I decided to share with you 5 slides, 5 photographs taken by Andrew Alberts of a recent building that we developed and designed together, my office, Heide von Beckerath, together with EV, and in collaboration with the Berlin Cooperative. And I have prepared 5 arguments or keywords. And the first one is work and live. And what I would like to contribute to this discussion is that when we talk about co-housing, we shouldn't shift housing to co-housing, but also think about what the changes in housing are and could be, and how our lives change and how we could integrate these changes into new concepts of living together. For example, like live and work. And I think this is obvious, has been obvious during the last weeks, that the organization of live and work is a challenge to housing. And that's what I want to contribute here. What you see on the photograph is no, go back, please. Yeah, this is a double height studio space on the ground floor of the residential and studio building at the former Berlin Flower Market. This is a quite large co-housing project. It's partly cooperative with rented apartments and partly in ownership. So there's an interesting combination of different ways of access to this building, and also it combines work and live. So there are, for example, people who live in the building and also work in the building. They might own an apartment and rent a studio, or vice versa, and so on and so on. What you see here is a studio space, but this is a couple who lives and works in the same place. And this is one of the studios, and to the left would be the entrance door to the public space, so the connection to the public space. And to the right is the living on the upper floor. And then there would be the studio space of the other partner, and then there would be a gallery space for access. So this space goes through the 23 to 25 meters of the building. And can we go to the next one? So the next one is privacy. I think that if we talk about co-housing, it should be clear that privacy is something we need. And I think co-housing cannot be without being aware of individual needs and private spaces. And I've chosen this photograph because it shows that the bedroom, it's a small bedroom, is not so different to the studio space. It has lower ceilings, but it has concrete walls and a concrete ceiling. And it shows that the whole building has done in an affordable way. So the idea was to shift from nice surfaces to flexible floor plans as a design approach. Mm-hmm. And the next one, although this stands for collectivity, this is the central access hall in the building. It's on the first floor, and it allows access to more than one level. We call it rue intérieure. It's a kind of middle hall, which usually is dark, but in this case we have 5 courtyards with daylight, and this makes this space a very nice space where here you can see it's an event. So it's a discussion we've organized together with the architecture magazine Arch Plus, which you might know. But you can see how many people can share the space at the same time. So it's just an example to get an idea of the scale. The next one is architecture. What you can see is one of the facades of the building, but it's not that I want to say that the facade is the architecture, but I would like to put your focus on the studio space on the rooftop. There are individual studios on the rooftop. And then you can see, if you look at it more closely, that the windows are on one hand standardized, designed, but standardized. On the other hand, they are customized to the floor plans behind. So you can see that there is a shift of, and also the tiling of the facade has more than one meaning. So on one hand, it's a kind of precious surface that reflects light and so on. But on the other hand, it has a certain coating that is able to wash itself or to clean itself, and also to produce oxygen. So it's also a contribution to the sustainability. They told us that, the producer told us that 1,000 square meters of this tiling would produce as much oxygen as a small forest, but we don't know what a small forest is. We don't know how large or small a small forest is. And the next one. The last one I called resilience, and there are two aspects about this. This is the roof, and we have a common access space on the roof, and you can see here to the left a detail that I like a lot. They are flower boxes that you can also use as a bench, and the flower boxes might be cared and planted by the people who live to the right, but the bench, of course, can be used by everyone because this place is not private and not public, it's in between. Mm. And also the artist who lives or who works in the studio to the right, he mentioned the word resilience once to me in a discussion. And he said after 1 year of use, there's a certain resilience about the building. And this is because the residents and the people who work there took part in the planning process. And this leads to a certain way of taking care for each other and living as a community. And he called this the resilient character of the building. I think that's it. Thank you.
That's it. Well, I think we can already see that co-housing is patently, obviously, a way of coming up with incredibly well-considered results. You know, the solutions, the decisions that are made can each be made with great care. So over to you. Thank you very much, Verena, and over to you, Frances.
Thank you. I'm ready for my slides. I've got 3 slides, and I think as I go through what I have to say, you'll see very common themes coming out. So this is a picture of Marmalade Lane, where I live, and the first thing I want to talk about really is the starting point is COVID and the lockdown, and somehow that has given permission to people generally to be more neighbourly. People have been reaching out to their neighbours, especially those who are old and more vulnerable, introducing themselves, helping them with their shopping, with their prescriptions. Sometimes aided by WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups have sort of popped up at a street-based level. I've heard accounts of people starting sharing food deliveries and gardening equipment and tools. So lots of spontaneous activities, really positive street-based activism that's happened as a result of lockdown. Mm. And I suppose what I've been reflecting on is how much more enjoyable and rewarding and how much more resilient and how more environmentally sustainable would living in cities and towns be if these seeds of more socially engaged and mutually supportive neighbourhoods took root and were the new normal. Mm. Of course, this is already normal in co-housing communities. Co-housing developments are purposely designed to encourage social interaction and collaboration, and people are choosing to live there because of that. And my next image, which takes me on to a new theme, is not from a co-housing community, one that I found really inspirational when I came across it on Twitter. And it's on the left-hand side, you have a back alley. You can just about see that it's completely overgrown, and it's the back of 2 rows of houses. And then on the right-hand side, you see a glimpse of what has started to happen to this alley during lockdown. People have obviously had a lot of time on their hands, but also a desire to be more sociable and meet their neighbours. And so it's been transformed all the way along the alley. So what I really wanted to talk about is my next slide, is this premise that we need to leave. Back one. I'm only on slide 2. So it's about this idea that you leave space for community. And I think good design is only part of what makes that happen. That there also needs to be space left for the community, and there are many elements to that. And one element is involving future residents in the design process, which is normal with co-housing. Really helps build the sense of community before anyone moves in, and it creates a strong sense of responsibility, both for the physical space and for each other. And it may take a bit longer doing it this way, but it makes a tangible difference to the outcomes. So that's one aspect of this. And the other is that these healthy, resilient neighbourhoods also need physical space where people can spend time together and have spaces they can shape together. And that's strong. I think a stronger sense of community is formed when you create something together. And I think that's a really good example. And not everything has to be finished when the builders and developers leave. So you can leave space for the community to take ownership. And a co-housing community, any shared space, inside or outside, is a really valuable asset to the community that they can shape and keep shaping as their needs and priorities change. So we don't really know what will follow from COVID-19, but we do know that we need to increase resilience at a local level, and having more of these spaces that are sort of communal spaces that communities can draw on in times of need, I think aids that. So my last slide is about diversity in housing, and this is an image during the build process and some of the future residents looking around. And I think COVID-19 has given more people experience of how communities perhaps used to be, that they remember a bit from their childhood, and opened up people's imaginations to what they could be again. And yeah, our housing market in the UK is geared to delivering monocultures. And if we want to create more resilient, sustainable communities, then we need to approach it differently. And co-housing, community-led housing, with their much more co-productive approaches, offer a model where future residents are both involved from the outset in shaping their own homes and communities, but also taking responsibility for them afterwards. And that, I think, is what really builds sustainable and resilient communities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Frances. I mean, just imagine if a scheme like Marmalade Lane could be part of every single mainstream housing development. I mean, it's clear that the architects and the developer town, although they didn't consciously design Marmalade Lane knowing there was a pandemic coming down the track, they have allowed enough, they've designed for enough space that's multifunctional, space for the imagination, space for all kinds of activities to take place in. So yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for summarizing the vision for an agenda for community living as we go from this pandemic era to the new era. One of the things that I did right before India went into lockdown was attend this exhibition on shared living that was put together by Space 10, which is a design laboratory supported by IKEA. And in that study, they said that in the next decade, we'll have 1.2 billion more humans, and 70% of us will be living in cities, and 1 in 3 of us will be living communally. And we were already in the era of the sharing economy. The millennials loved not just sharing, but just living communally. I think the concept of home was already changing. A lot of the millennials did not seek home ownership. They were looking at homes almost as a service. And, as we transition from the economy pre-COVID and we have to kind of start thinking about road to recovery, I think it makes sense to kind of dig deep and define what do we mean by community living or co-living or shared living or co-housing. How is this different from the existing housing typologies that we've already seen in contemporary cities? What are the components that will make co-living different from existing residential? Frances, do you want to start answering that question?
Yeah, so I would approach it really in the context of co-housing, where I would see that as a form of sociable housing, where there's a blend of private space, which I think is really important, and shared spaces, and where there's an intention to live in a more neighbourly way, and the design is being used to support that intention. So in a typical co-housing community, there is a common house with maybe a living room, dining room, kitchen, laundry, workshop space, guest bedrooms, those kind of shared facilities. But everyone still has their own home and with their own modest amount of outdoor space as well, whether that's a garden or a balcony. And then there is an emphasis on that shared garden. And there isn't a shared economy normally, but there's plenty of sharing going on, as you indicated. The sort of sharing economy nonetheless is really important. And typically there are shared meals a few times a week where community members can come, join in, and I think that's a really important part of community living, which we have been missing during COVID. and then all sorts of other things are being shared too: cars, tools, garden equipment, all shared. Contents of our larders in particular. So I think whilst it's a diverse movement in terms of co-housing or cooperative forms of housing, there is a common thread, and it is about the sort of co-productive approach where the housing and communities have been developed with future residents or even by future residents, and they go on to manage their community themselves. And it's that ownership, self-ownership thing that I think is quite important.
Verena, I visited you in Berlin, and you actually gave us a little tour of the co-op that you had worked on. And I was fascinated by the approach of developing a co-op. So I think it'd be nice I'd love to hear your definition of co-living, shared living, co-housing, but also if you could kind of, dig up a few layers and explain how a co-living or a shared living space comes about. And you should definitely share, your own experience as an architect, especially from a design perspective on delivering some of these shared living.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's quite a complex question because co-housing as a first definition means like living together, right? You could say that people who live on the same street are somehow sharing the street and are living together. But then the question is, how is co-housing related to density and to living in the city where there's less space? And then the next step could be how people who want to live together could initiate a project that is somehow a shared house or shared space. And I think we have been quite successful together with other parties, like, for example, we are architects, we have been part of the development of co-housing projects, but there are also other people like a project manager who organizes the participation process and so on, even though we have also created parts of this process, how to involve people into certain design decisions. But there are many people involved. But on the other hand, we think that in Berlin, it has been quite privileged to become a member in a co-housing project because it was based on purchased land. So you need some money to be able to acquire the land. And that's why we were very much interested in a new initiative by the Senate of Berlin to have concept-based biddings where a group that is already founded has the opportunity to bid with a concept instead of the highest offer. So that was the beginning of our career in co-housing, maybe, and that was quite interesting. And during 2 or 3 projects of this kind, the policy approach has changed, luckily, and now the city of Berlin is talking about ground lease and leasehold land, where the land that the city owns and is given to projects like co-housing project is taken out of the market. So it's taken out of the speculation for housing. So that's quite an interesting development. On the other hand, as an architect, I'm extremely interested in developing an approach to co-housing where there is not only apartments and shared space, but where the whole building and all aspects of the design process and all elements of the building are contributing to living together. For example, at R50, the co-housing, that's the project that you were mentioning, Prathima, we have worked together with a group of, some of them are artists, many of them are working in the creative industries, and they were quite aware of the privilege they had to be part of this project, and they were very much taking part in the discussion about shared spaces and private spaces and individual needs and collective needs and so on. And besides a shared space, a community space that can be used by the inhabitants, but that can also be used for people from the neighborhood. They can organize events and so on. The space has 4 entrance doors, so one from the inner building, one from the entrance, and another one from the street, so that it can be used in many different ways, more public, more private, and so on. Besides this, we were very much interested in the staircase, for example, or we decided to have all-around balconies without separation. So you could say that the whole all-around balcony system, which is balconies all around the freestanding building, is a kind of shared space where people live together and they share their own private open space. Yeah, children can visit each other like a street that surrounds the apartments. Then there is, of course, the garden and the rooftop and so on. So we were very much working on different elements of a building that could contribute to co-housing. And then was the next building, the flower market building at the former flower market hall. It was a much larger scale, and also the owners gave some money to the cooperative so that they can stay with the same rent for 10 years or so. So it has become more and more complex, but still there's this idea of economy, standards, common standards, shared standards, and the idea of a circulation space that serves as a space for communication and chatting and so on. So I don't know if this is enough for the moment.
I think both your descriptions for co-housing and the way to make them come alive is going to make a lot of people crave that kind of lifestyle, especially during this lockdown where we've all been stuck within our homes without access to a social life or even a common space to meet others and have access to the outdoors. And in a way, as we transition out of the old normal, one of the things that we really have to do is move away from the consumerist economy. So in a way, maybe this community living idea could empower us, to that world and allow us also to truly share among the community. So thank you so much for that description and definition.
Can I add something at this point?
Sure.
What I was describing is like an experimental approach to co-housing that has been initiated by people who are aware of time, economy, a kind of approach to their own future and the future of the community. But there are many people who don't have the time and don't have the money and don't have the opportunity to think 3 or 5 years ahead and cannot wait. And that's a little bit my problem to this kind of initiatives. So that's why we became really interested how we could deliver these elements in a little bit different way, but how we could, in our architectural projects, architecture, how we can take this knowledge and bring it to social housing, where the situation is a little bit different and people didn't choose to live together. They had no time to participate. But they have low rents and they need these apartments with low rents. So how can we introduce some of these aspects into, a different kind of development and substituted housing? That's what I'm really interested in. So I think we can highlight those experimental buildings, but we should also be aware that these are like prototypes, and what we need to do is to learn from them. And yeah.
So that leads me to a question which, moving on from the prototype, which is in itself quite a challenging way, but a really, really rewarding way of doing that. In your respective roles as architect, Verena, and Frances, head of community partnering, there are two key themes here, which came up in Verena's presentation on live work, and then the multi-generational side of co-housing, which embraces both of your work and activities. What are the main challenges to creating successful live work and creating successful multi-generational co-housing, would you say, and how do you overcome them going forward in the next, uncertain period of time, out through the pandemic into the new era?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
So I think I'll pick up the intergenerational aspect, because Marmalade Lane set out to be intergenerational, and actually it's 42 homes, market sale homes, so not affordable. We're in Cambridge in England. It's not affordable homes in any sense of the. So trying to create an intentional community in that context could have been really hard. And for us, the way we achieved that was just having a really large spread of property sizes, from 1 bed to 2 beds, and within every permutation to 5 beds, and within that, lots of each one coming in a small version and a large version, but just a big mix of sizes and therefore prices. And particularly because they were supplemented with quite generous shared spaces, I think it's been viable for people who perhaps are capital rich to downsize, but equally for younger people to purchase properties that perhaps otherwise would be smaller than they would otherwise have looked for, but they can see how it fits in within the context of what they're really wanting, which is a sort of, in busy lives, also a really good sense of community around them.
Thank you.
I'll pass it.
Yeah, Verena.
Okay. Of course, the intergenerational approach is very much dependent on the range of apartments and also apartment sizes that the project offers. And if there's only 2-room apartments, or only what is now fashionable with developers, single room apartments, developers can make a lot of money with it, because there are more apartments than if you would have larger apartments. But I think it's the mixed program that is interesting, that is inclusive, and that includes not only different generations, but also different ways of living in all kinds of aspects. Not only families with 2 children, but also groups of people who want to share their lives or whatever. And the other thing that is interesting, your question for work and live, I think there are some aspects that are quite interesting. One is building regulations. For example, in many European cities, building regulations are still based on the separation of work and live, because the idea about housing was quietness and green, and sometimes I think it comes from the late industrialization, where there was dirt and dust on one side of the city and the nice housing areas on the other side of the city. But if we think about living together and a mix of work and live, I think we also have to think about new building regulations where it's not separated anymore, as a general approach to urban neighborhoods. And the other thing is that I come back to, as an example, the Berlin housing associations that are owned by the city. They make profit, but only little profit. And the idea is that 50% of the apartments they are building is for a rent of €6.50. So that's what I meant before. How can we address this kind of production of housing? And the question is, how can we integrate work and live? Because these housing associations, they have the goal, it's a policy goal, to deliver housing. So the mix of work and live is not part of their approach. Yeah, it's not part of the financial background, the financial regulations behind. Even shared spaces are not part of the program. So, for example, with one of our projects we did with one housing association, we were not allowed to produce shared space because it's not part of the program. It's definitely not part of the program of a city-owned housing association. So we offered a bicycle storage space in a very good location to the courtyard, and we put a tap, and we said if the residents take the bicycles out, they can use it and we have a large doors that you can, folding doors and so on. So we used a kind of trick, an approach to shared space that was not meant to be there. So I think it's the programs of the developers and the housing associations on one hand, but also the building, in a larger scale, the building regulations for cities and new areas for housing as two of maybe more aspects. Yeah.
I want to, one of the economic ideas we need to let go of is around speculative capitalism. And if we applied the ideals of shared living at the urban level, we have this whole model of community land trusts. And, from an economic perspective, for me, they are a mechanism to remove the land from the speculative real estate marketplace in a way, so that communities actually have a say in what they want to do in their communities and keep land more affordable, not just for housing, but other amenities that they need as in their neighborhood. So what's your view on this? How would you define community land trusts, and why are they important to us? Francis?
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. It's a way of locking away the land value and locking in affordability and community benefit in perpetuity. And so in the UK, I think we are increasingly seeing a blended approach to cooperative housing, community-led housing, co-housing. They're all sort of blending together. So, and with that CLT structure helping lock in that affordable community benefit. So I think that's a really exciting development in the UK and really essential to enable this sort of alternative way of living, not just to be those people who've got the time and the money to access it, And I think the CLT structures is going to help unlock that. So it's definitely a really important part now of what's emerging. And I think,
yeah.
I was just going to say, and I think there's been a, they now really fall under the umbrella of community-led housing. And I think the CLT structures are, with their high focus on affordability and benefit to local communities, is now also beginning to learn from the sort of co-housing movement and really emphasize that sort of co-production and resident involvement in the process and the end in terms of management. And I think their strategies begun to be really exciting.
Verena?
I think to introduce leasehold land to the housing, to the development of housing, is the only way to manage the social justice beyond, between people who need a house, and that's everyone in the world. I mean, everyone. So I think this is a very important discussion. And again, in Berlin, the 2 concept-based biddings we took part in were, leading in the right direction, because the best concept, the most interesting concept, and not the highest offer was chosen. But now the city-owned land is only given on a ground lease basis to developers or groups. So that has shifted in the last years, and I think it's a very good idea. I mean, it's the only way to stop the immense increasement of rent and price per square meter.
Yeah, I think we need the community to be the stewards of their own land and, use them as resources as they see, apt.
Definitely. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, in the UK, there were traditionally community land trusts were much more common in rural areas because of the much lower land values, and really uphill task to create them in a big metropolis like London. But we do need them in both our cities and our towns. I think there are now over 300 CLTs in the UK, and they've all learning hugely from one another. And the CLT body that represents them all is a massively important organism for shared information and shared learning and so on. So I cannot quite foresee how they are going to expand in the next 5 or 6 years, but I hope and pray that they can actually gain in momentum in terms of their activities.
But Lucy, I think one of the questions that we should explore at some point is, what would our cities, which are kind of hearts of global capital, look like if community land trusts own most of the land there?
Oh, right. Well, that's
a good question to ask, huh?
That's going into Dutch scenario planning there, where at one end of the spectrum, you've got kind of arch capitalistic perspective on cities, which say architects like Patrick Schumacher would maybe like to promote. Well, we know he does. And on the other end of the spectrum, something which is much more genuinely grounded in socialism and social justice. But it leads us on to really this mega question of, well, what policy environment do we need to help enable good co-housing to exist, or community-led solutions? The policy environment is considerably different in the UK to compared with Germany. What more can we be doing in both of those countries, Verena and Francis, since they're the fields in which you work principally? What more can be done? What new initiatives are already being put into place which are commendable, which are good? What more needs to be done in the next 2 or 3 years?
I think in the UK, I think it would be around finding a mechanism where the social value that co-housing or any form of cooperative housing is bringing to an area is recognised. And I think that is something that we're not yet good at doing. But I think it's a really important element of it. And ironically, Marmalade Lane came into being really because of the last financial crash. So there's maybe an opportunity ahead. And at a time when speculative developers were really not building anymore, that gave the landowner, the local authority who owned the land, an opportunity to try something different. And for them, then it was that they were then prepared to think more in terms of the social value than the land value.
Yeah.
And I think that's that. Without that willingness to begin to recognise that social value, it wouldn't have happened. And I think that is the key really now.
Very interesting. Verena, on the policy context?
Yeah, I think I was thinking during the last minutes that I think it's not only about capitalism versus socialism, because we know that socialism had its problems as well. I think it's about developing new narratives that are independent from economical systems. For example, I find it quite interesting that some Japanese architects go to the countryside, to rural areas, and study the way how rural communities work and how they rely on each other, how they share like a forest or community-owned land. And I think it's a lot about, thinking about creating maybe narratives or images how shared life could be, and then thinking about processes and policy advice, and of course architecture, because architecture can contribute something. But I think the narrative is quite important, because you cannot work with people without having a story together. I mean,
Yeah, that's very profound. Observing in a more anthropological way, without bias, how people prefer to share things, different, more fruitful ways of going about it, and then them building policy out of those observations of everyday life, something that goes beyond party political debates. That's something that all politicians should fundamentally recognize. Yeah, that's really, really.
And maybe I could add, for now, from a Berlin perspective, the Senate of Berlin has a great focus on housing, and it seems as if they try to keep the range of projects and developments as diverse as possible. So they support private initiatives, they support cooperatives, they support, of course, the city-owned housing associations, and they try to diversify the offer of residential space. And I think for now it's a good idea, because there should be a survey, but I think it's a good idea to have different processes and different ways of involving people in a maybe shorter period of time and a longer period of time, and so on.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I just want to take a moment to say hello to the audience that is joining us from all over. We have some comments here and a question as well. Bethram, hello, thanks for joining us. Yolan, thank you for joining us. We have a question that's going to put our speakers on a spot, but because I don't know if they've worked in the developing world context. The question is, how applicable is co-living concept and shared space to develop in a developing world context, especially in brownfield informal settlements or high density housing projects. This question is from Jessica Ramchand.
Can I contribute to this?
Yes,
I think
sure.
this is a very important question.
Mm.
And when I said before that the projects I have mentioned is based on a certain privilege of decision making and being able to decide for their own lives, this is not the case everywhere. But your question is interesting because I have one student who is working on her thesis. She is in Guayaquil, Ecuador at the moment, but she's working on a project in Lima. And her approach is that she presented to us a community, it's called San Cristobal. It's a community in Lima with informal housing since the 1920s. And she says that the main quality of this informal neighborhood, which is very difficult to access, and old people they cannot walk on the stairs and so on because it's on a slope of a mountain, is that because they have come from the countryside, they still live in a community in the third generation and they care for each other. And her idea is to propose a co-housing project exactly in this area because she thinks that co-housing is already there. So this is my answer to this question.
If I can just quickly comment from the Indian context, which is where I'm from, I want to highlight that a large part of our vernacular architecture was about the communal space. The courtyard housing, the verandas on the edge of our houses, which was an interface between the public space, which was the street, and the housing, which is more private. So historically, our traditional architecture was all about community. And I think we need to bring that back, as I keep saying. And one of the great things about, the slums, even though, I agree that we have to revive them for better living condition, because it's very inhuman to live in the slums with no access to water and sanitation. But one idea that we have to retain from the slums of Indian cities is the idea of community capital. The amount of community network, the social networks within that space is amazing. And, it doesn't replicate in the, the projects of New York or, the ghettos for poor communities that are there in Western cities, which are places that I've lived in, and I often find it really scary to walk there at parts of the night, whether you're in San Francisco or New York. But I could walk into Dharavi, which is one of the big slums of Mumbai, late at night, and there's children, there's grandmothers, we're looking after your neighbor's children. So that community capital already exists. Obviously the physical built environment doesn't, the infrastructure doesn't, and we need to improve that. Lucy?
Well, I was just going to quickly say, when I went to Dharavi, one thing that I took from that was absolutely the point that you made. And also, I noticed that lots of people make their living, they're self-employed, and they make their living recycling materials that they collect. And they store the materials in their homes. And so this was with the London School of Economics Urban Age project that we went. And that's where I think we met up at the University of Bombay. But it seemed to me that the alternative housing solutions that the municipality was proposing or delivering would have actually meant that the spatial dimensions of their home units would not have allowed them to continue their self-employed activities. There wasn't
and
that
community.
Yeah, there was exactly. There wasn't that more organic sense of live work that that we find very desirable in lockdown, but a lot of people rely on for their livelihoods.
And this is such a crucial agenda as we think about the future, because it's really key to a happy, healthy society. I remember at that Urban Age conference which was in Mumbai, which I think was the first time we met, or I don't know if we met earlier than that. It was almost a decade ago. And I remember meeting with the mayor of DC was there. I don't know if it was he was the current mayor of DC. And he walked into Dharavi, and I met him immediately after, and he was completely shocked at how safe it was and the communal feeling there. Because he said, I could not do this in the kind of projects of DC, which is the capital of, at that point, the most powerful and rational global country of the world. So it's so this is such a great conversation, and we really enjoyed kind of peeling the layers of what makes shared living. Lucy?
Have we got time for one more question, Prathima?
No, I think we are already over time. And I think
this is a topic where you can be indefatigable and talk about it all day, because, as you say, there are so many layers to it, and it has such an urgency to it. People, we are in a genuine crisis, but I think it's been a really, really fruitful conversation. It's fantastic to get together like this. So thank you both so much for your participation. It was brilliant to see you. I met both of you before now, and it's just we must get together in real time when we have some opportunity and have a dinner together. Every single week we need to propose a dinner.
Thank you for the invitation. It was really very inspiring to join this.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So
thank you.
Yeah,
I just want to say thank you to both. This was really, I really enjoyed the conversation and how you described shared a living. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. Especially thank you to the Architectural Foundation community. We are part of the 100-day studio that they have been hosting, which has been really, really interesting. Thanks again for joining us. Join us at the same time next week on Tuesday, and that would be 9 p.m. India time, 4:30 p.m. London time. And 11:30.
5:30 Berlin time.
5:30 CST. Yeah.
So join us next week. We are going to be reimagining and rethinking mobility, especially non-motorized mobility, with two amazing guests. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day and evening, and stay safe.
Prathima, can we announce our two guests before we go off?